Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a philosophical work from 1793 that asked a question so radical for its time. It basically flipped the whole relationship between morality and religion on its head.
It really did.
The question is, what if the truth of a sacred text or any claim of a divine message wasn't decided by miracles or prophecies or, dusty historical evidence? What if instead you had to run it through this rigorous, purely philosophical test that was rooted only in human morality?
It's a profound inversion. And we are talking about Johann Gottlieb's text, Versuch einer Kritik aller Offenbarung.
Which means attempt at a critique of all revelation.
Exactly. And when this first came out, it caused a huge uproar. I mean, partly because a lot of people just assumed it was written by Immanuel Kant.
Wow.
Yeah. The philosophical rigor, the strict application of critical principles, it just screamed Kant.
The stakes here feel incredibly high. And Freud is very clear. He's not trying to debunk Christianity or any one religion.
No, not at all. His mission is it's to conduct a critique of all possible revelation. He wants to completely abstract away from history, from any specific text, and just derive universal principles from pure reason.
It has to be purely philosophical.
Purely. Grounded in principles he derives a priori, which for him means from practical reason. He's trying to build a kind of a philosophical constitution, you could say?
A constitution that any divine message would have to obey to be seen as legitimate.
That's it. And he sets the tone right from the preface. He basically says, look, I'm committing myself to the truth and I don't care about the political fallout. I don't care which party, religious or secular, is pleased or offended by this.
He's really applying the Enlightenment scalpel to the most sensitive topic there is.
He's building a framework. Think of it like a philosophical sieve. Only the divine claims that perfectly harmonize with the moral law, which Fichte sees as the most certain fact of our consciousness, only those can pass through.
And anything that contradicts that law, no matter how miraculous its supposed origin.
It's rejected. It has to.
So our mission today is to explore this foundation Fichte built. We're going to follow his whole argument, from his deep analysis of the human will to how he deduces the existence of God.
And then the really interesting part, the practical need for revelation, especially for people who are, let's say, morally weak.
And then we'll spend a good amount of time on his 7 very strict criteria for judging whether something is actually divine. We really need to get into the philosophical mechanics here.
Absolutely. And to do that, we have to start where Fichte starts, with what it even means to be a free agent who can make a choice.
Right. The theory of the will. Fichte needs to secure the whole basis of moral responsibility. So he kicks things off with this dense but really essential distinction about human action. How does he draw the line between just potential and an actual moral choice?
He starts by clarifying the difference between Begehrungsvermögen and Willen. So Begehrungsvermögen is the faculty of desire. It's just the potential, the capacity within us to want or seek something.
It's the engine, but it's not in gear yet.
Exactly. Then you have Willen, which is willing or action. That's the actual conscious activity of producing a representation in your mind that then leads to an action. It's when the potential becomes actual.
And that distinction is everything, isn't it? Because it makes sure we're not just like passive dominoes getting knocked over by stimuli.
Precisely. If we were just the faculty of desire, we'd be deterministic. We'd just follow the strongest impulse. But Willen, or willing, that suggests an active, self-produced element is at play.
Okay, so then he breaks down desire, and he starts with the more mechanical one, right? The lower desire.
Yes, the lower or sensual desire, which he calls tribe, a drive. This one is entirely determined by Empfindung sensation, or feeling. The object has to be given to you through your senses, your Sinnlichkeit.
And what makes you act is always just what's pleasant.
The angenä. The agreeable. That's the only thing that determines this drive.
But this is where he introduces that subtle but really important complexity about what sensual even means.
Yes, this is key. Fichte points out that this sensual drive isn't just about, food and physical comfort, the grobsinnlich or grossly sensual drives.
Things related to outer space or physical bodies.
Right. It also includes the feinsinnlich, the finely sensual, and these are related to our inner senses, to time. It's the pleasure you might get from a beautiful piece of music, or the intellectual satisfaction of solving a complex proof.
Or even just the psychological comfort of getting a compliment.
That's a perfect example.
So hold on. If I spend, say, 10 years mastering the violin, but my ultimate motivation is that intense inner satisfaction I get from playing a perfect sonata, In Fichte's system, that's still a sensual drive.
It is. He's very strict on this. He insists that these fine sensual pleasures, even though they feel so much more elevated, they only differ from gross sensual pleasure in degree.
Not in kind.
Not in kind. They are just more complex ways of seeking the agreeable. If pleasure, however refined or intellectual it is the ultimate goal, then the drive is sensual, period.
Okay, so that sets the stage for how he defines the human pursuit of Glück happiness. If all these complex, agreeable feelings fall under this one sensual drive, how do we organize them into a coherent life goal?
Well, that's where Urteilskraft, or the faculty of judgment, comes in. Judgment takes all these scattered, agreeable sensations and it organizes them. It applies rules of understanding to create a system for enjoyment over time.
And that system, that's what we call happiness.
That's what he calls happiness. He calls it a calculus of sensual enjoyment. It's basically a strategic plan to maximize agreeable states over the long term.
A very methodical, almost German approach to hedonism.
You could say that. And critically, this happiness is completely subjective. It has to be. Because it's based on my sensations, what I find agreeable. So Fichte says it's purely empirical.
I can't know what makes you happy, and you can't know what makes me happy.
We can't. My optimized system is not your optimized system. And if you extend this personal calculus out to infinity, you get the idea of Glückseligkeit bliss or felicitation. But even that is still just my individual, empirically based pleasure formula stretched out forever.
So it has no universal power. It can't be a moral law. If we stop here, we're just sophisticated pleasure-seeking machines.
We're slaves to our own individual programming for pleasure. Morality, which absolutely demands universality, just can't come from this system. It's a dead end.
So we need the break. We need that moment of true spontaneität. How does Fichte will find the lever that lifts us out of this mechanistic world?
He argues that even to organize your happiness, to do that calculus, you need a certain capacity. You have to be able to hit pause on the immediate pull of the sensual drive.
You have to be able to say no to the cookie right in front of you because you're saving room for the cake later.
Exactly. You have to interrupt that stimulus-response flow to assess, to calculate, to choose a path that defers gratification. And this capacity for interruption, this move of absolute spontaneity, that is the essential break from the machine.
That's the foundation of what he calls the upper or moral desire.
It is. True willing must be based on a representation whose content is not given by your senses. It has to be produced by that absolute spontaneity.
But if the material isn't sensory, what is it? What does the moral will actually act on?
Fichte uses a technical argument here. He says the material of the moral will has to be form in itself. We're not talking about the content of what we want, but the inherent form of the desiring faculty itself.
Okay, that's a bit abstract.
It is. The only thing that fits this description, the only thing that is pure form related to the power of desire is the idea of the schlechten Rechten, the unconditionally right, the moral law.
So the will is essentially looking at its own structure and realizing what it must be, what its own law is.
Precisely. And the existence of this self-legislating unconditional imperative is, for Fichte, a secure fact of consciousness. And it's the proof that we have a free will, something fundamentally different from those lower empirical drives.
So now we have the will.
Mm-hmm.
But how does this abstract moral form actually translate into real-world action? It has to fight against the powerful momentum of the sensual drive.
Okay.
It needs a medium, right? A feeling.
It does, and that medium is Achtung, or respect. This is a concept he gets from Kant, of course, but he really elaborates on its function. Respect is not a sensual pleasure, it's a negative affection. It's the feeling you get when your sensual drive's arrogance gets checked by the moral law.
It's that internal friction, that feeling of, I want to do this, but I know I shouldn't.
That's it exactly. It's the pure moral drive, and it arises from that constraint. But, and here's where it gets really interesting, Fichte is very careful. He says that while it's a negative constraint on your senses, this feeling is accompanied by a unique and intense kind of internal satisfaction.
This is the unendlich übertreffenden Vergnügen, the infinitely surpassing pleasure.
The infinitely surpassing pleasure. It's a pleasure far beyond any sensual delight.
We have to pause on that phrase. An infinitely surpassing pleasure. If doing your duty brings pleasure, doesn't that risk collapsing this whole system back into the lower desires calculus? Aren't we just choosing a better feeling pleasure?
That's the million-dollar question, and Fichte tackles it head-on. He clarifies that the source of the pleasure is what makes all the difference. The pleasure from, say, A good meal is caused by the external sensation, the agreeable matter.
Right.
But the pleasure that comes from Achtung, this self-contentment, is caused by the self-legislation of pure reason, by the internal form.
So it's not the pleasure of getting something, it's the pleasure of being something,
Yeah.
being a moral agent.
Yes. And to become an active drive in the world, this respect has to relate to yourself as Selbstachtung, self-respect. This moral interest we have in our own dignity, that's what produces the feeling of self-contentment, Selbstzufriedenheit, when we do our duty.
So we have an interest in the law because it's our law. It secures our own freedom. This is how he avoids making virtue seem totally joyless and grim.
Exactly. It makes morality deeply desirable, but for reasons that come from reason itself, not from appetite.
And just to wrap up this section on the will, he makes one last crucial distinction about freedom.
Right. Two meanings. First, there's the universal transcendental freedom. That's the non-dependence on natural necessity that makes the moral law possible in the first place. This is a condition for any moral system, even for God.
And then there's our day-to-day struggle.
That is the empirical freedom of choice, libertas arbitriae. This is what we feel in ourselves, the capacity to choose between the moral drive and the sensual drive in any specific case. The whole moral law depends on the first kind of freedom. Our actual moral life happens in the second.
Okay, so Fichte has established this picture of the human being as a creature of two worlds. We're subject to the mechanical world of sensible desire, but we're also part of this free world of the moral imperative. But we live our lives in the sensible world. So how do you reconcile the two? How do you make sure that the moral law doesn't just, command us to do things that make a happy life impossible?
That's the next big problem he has to solve. The moral law's first job is negative. It restricts the happiness drive, it tells you what you may not do, and this creates the whole sphere of recht, or white.
Yeah.
But like you said, if the moral law just demanded constant, draining self-sacrifice that made life fundamentally miserable, it would kind of undermine itself, wouldn't it? If the law tells me I have to give up my life to save a stranger, but the law also grants me a right to my life, that's a contradiction.
It is. The moral life has to be possible within the empirical world. So for the human being to function as a coherent whole, the moral law has to affect the happiness drive positively too. There has to be what he calls a primat, a primacy of the moral over the sensual.
A required harmony.
A required harmony, yes. And this congruence, this idea that moral behavior should line up with the fate and outcomes you experience in the world, that's what Fichte calls Glückswürdigkeit, worthiness of happiness. So it's not a guarantee that if you're moral, you will be happy. It's that you are worthy of being happy. And reason demands that the universe should eventually respect that worthiness.
The moral law, being absolute, demands a world order where moral causality ultimately wins out over blind physical causality. But we can't guarantee that.
We can't. We're finite beings. We're subject to laws of physics and chance that often seem to reward the bad and punish the good.
And this is the philosophical chasm, a chasm that only a necessary postulate can bridge.
This is the moment where practical reason, by its own internal logic, has to deduce God.
Yes, because the highest good, that perfect union of worthiness and happiness, is something we can't achieve on our own. Therefore, reason must postulate a necessary being who has both the power and the will to bring that congruence about.
A being that connects the moral law with the laws of physics.
A being who unites moral necessity with absolute physical freedom. And this being is God.
So believing in God isn't just an emotional choice or a leap of faith in the dark. For Fichte, it's a necessary conclusion that our own moral reason forces on us.
You have to assume God exists to prevent the moral law from becoming a contradiction in your experience. The conclusion is as certain as the premise. Fichte just states it flatly. Es ist ein Gott. There is a God.
And since God is derived purely from the moral law, all of his attributes have to be defined by what the law requires.
Exactly. Fichte just runs down the list of what God must be like.
Okay, walk us through this divine character sheet.
Well, first, God must be holy. This means God is determined only by the moral law, with zero sensual restriction or inclination. God is pure will.
Makes sense.
Second, God must be omnipotent and blissful. Omnipotent because only absolute power can actually make the world line up with morality. And blissful because the perfect congruence of his own holy will and its outcome would bring the highest possible self-contentment.
The ultimate Selbstzufriedenheit.
The ultimate. Third, God must be completely just. He has to be the executor of the moral law to make sure that worthiness is actually matched by happiness.
Okay.
Fourth, God must be omniscient. To be just, God has to know everything, all the natural laws, but also, crucially, every single free moral decision made by every single being. Justice needs perfect information.
And finally, this leads to immortality.
It has to, because the demand of the moral law on us is infinite. You can always become more moral. The possibility of meeting that infinite demand requires an infinite amount of time, so every moral being must be eternal.
And this whole magnificent structure is built on what he calls Glauben belief, or faith. But it's a very specific kind of faith, isn't it?
It's a rational faith. It's not a commandment. The law doesn't command you to believe these things. It only commands action. These are postulates, necessary assumptions that reason requires for the law to keep its meaning for finite beings like us.
So that completes the purely philosophical deduction of religion. But if we can derive all of this from pure reason, why on earth would Fichte, this champion of a priori philosophy, even need to talk about an actual historical revelation?
This is the crucial move from philosophical theology to practical religion. Theology is just looking at these truths theoretically. Religion happens when you start to act according to the law of reason because you see it as God's law.
You're transferring the legislative authority outside yourself.
For the purpose of determining your will, yes.
But again, if the law is already inside me, in my heart, why do I need an external lawgiver?
Fichte says it's because of a subjective need. He focuses on the very real human condition of moral weakness. The problem is, even though we know the moral law, we are in a constant battle with the causal laws of nature, with our sensual inclinations.
And that constant fight can wear you down. It can diminish your respect for your own reason.
You start to doubt its power. You start to think, well, I can sin at my own risk. The only person I'm letting down is myself, and that's a risk I'm willing to take.
And that's the moment when the idea of God as an external lawgiver becomes a necessary scaffold.
Precisely. He calls this process entoiserum, the transfer of authority. It reinforces your own respect for the law by externalizing it. When you see duty as commanded by God, suddenly you're not just responsible for the act itself, you're responsible for showing disrespect to the most holy eternal being. The stakes feel higher.
That feels a little, I don't know, a bit like a psychological trick, though. Isn't that just replacing one form of heteronomy, being a slave to your desires, with another, being a slave to your fear of God?
That is the essential tension, and Fichte knows it. He argues that this transfer of authority is a pragmatic tool. It's for the purpose of will determination. It's not the ultimate ground of morality itself.
So for the morally weak person, seeing the law as God's command just strengthens their own internal drive to listen to their reason.
It's a mechanism to help the will win the fight against inclination. It's not a substitute for the will. I mean, if the person acts only out of fear, then no, they're not moral. But if the idea of God helps them choose the moral law freely, then it serves a necessary, even if temporary, purpose.
It's like a training wheel for the conscience.
That's a great way to put it. Fichte says a morally sound person only needs religion for reverence and gratitude. But the weak person, the one struggling, they need natural religion to reinforce their moral drive through this living idea of a holy judge.
But then he pushes it even further. What about the most difficult case?
The case where moral feeling is completely dormant, suppressed.
A state of deep moral decay where the person doesn't even have the will to recognize a moral law.
And Fichte is clear, this isn't humanity's natural state. It's accidental. It's the result of a terrible upbringing or overwhelming sensuality or living in conditions of just brutal necessity where survival is all that matters.
For those people, natural religion is impossible. You can't deduce God from a moral feeling you don't have.
You can't. And so, for these individuals, this is the one and only point where an actual, empirical, historical, often barring a revelation, becomes a true necessity.
Because it has to reach them through the only door they have open.
Through Sinnlichkeit. Through their senses. God has to announce himself to them immediately through the senses and demand obedience immediately through the senses.
Which means messengers, prophets, and appeals to authority that completely bypass philosophy.
It has to. The messengers have to ground their authority immediately on divine power, because that's what sensual beings can understand and admire. They can't appreciate God's holiness yet because they don't have the moral sense for it, but they can be awed by his power and greatness.
Which brings us right back to that critical caveat. If God is appealing to power, how does Fichte stop this from just becoming raw authoritarianism?
He is absolutely adamant on this point. The display of great power, the miracle, it's intended only to gain Aufmerksamkeit, attention.
It's the divine fire alarm. It's just there to make you look up.
It's the necessary noise to cut through the sensual noise of their world. Once attention is gained, obedience must still be grounded in the moral content of the message that follows. If obedience is only maintained through the constant threat of power, then the religion is self-contradictory, it's heteronomy, and it serves no moral purpose at all.
So the miracle gets your attention, but the message has to win your reason.
Exactly. The miracle is never the proof of the message itself.
And this leads us directly into the real core of his work, the criterion, the strict criteria that any alleged revelation has to meet. Let's start with the criteria about the form, the external stuff.
These first three are like foundational moral roadblocks.
Okay, criterion 1.
Yeah.
Moral purity of content. The content has to fully agree with the moral law of practical reason. If it tells you to do anything immoral, anything that contradicts that unconditional right, it's not from God.
This is the absolute non-negotiable. The moral law is universal. God is wholly defined by that law. So God cannot contradict himself. This means any revelation that commands cruelty or exploitation or violating human dignity, it fails instantly.
Regardless of the historical context.
Regardless, the moral law inside you is a higher authority than the written word outside you.
Then, criterion 2, no deceit. Any revelation that's been announced or spread using betrug deceit, pious fraud, is not from God.
This is a direct shot at things like forging documents, faking prophecies, inventing miracles to boost belief. You can't justify an immoral act by claiming it serves a good end. Fichte's logic is simple. If a prophet truly speaks for an omnipotent, holy God, they wouldn't need to lie.
And if you find out there was deceit, the whole thing collapses. Reverence turns to indignation.
Instantly. It destroys the moral utility.
Okay, and criterion 3, no coercion. Any revelation established through force, persecution, or violence is not from God.
This is his defense of freedom of conscience. Coercion can only get you external legality. You make the person act correctly because they're scared, but it destroys internal morality, which has to come from free choice.
If the whole point is to make us morally good, using immoral means is just a contradiction in terms.
It is. So any religion that relies on state power or forced conversions or inquisitions, it fails the test immediately.
These external criteria are pretty robust, but the next set, the criteria about the internal doctrine, they feel even more radical. They dictate what a divine message literally cannot say.
Here we get to the Kantian limits of human understanding. So criterion 4, no new theoretical knowledge. A revelation cannot give us an expansion of our theoretical knowledge of the supersensible.
Meaning no specific details about what God is made of or the exact mechanics of the afterlife or how free will and physics link up.
None of it.
That seems so counterintuitive. Why would God, the source of all truth, hold back facts about reality?
Fichte gives two huge reasons. The first is the moral impossibility. He says if we were given objective, theoretical certainty about the infinite majesty of God or the specific rewards of heaven, that knowledge would be so overwhelming it would compel our obedience.
There'd be no choice. The infinite majesty would just crush our ability to choose otherwise.
Exactly. It would annihilate the struggle. It would turn us, and this is his phrase, into moral machines with expanded knowledge. And if we can't freely choose virtue, there's no merit, no struggle, and so there's no moral freedom.
And God can't want that.
God cannot want that because the whole point of the moral law is the exercise of freedom. So the mystery of the supersensible has to be maintained for our own liberty.
That is a staggering claim. God has to self-censor objective truth to protect our moral agency.
It is. And the second reason is the physical impossibility. Our minds work with categories like time and space. If you tried to translate objective truths about the supersensible into those categories, you'd just drag the supernatural down into the sensible world. It would stop being supernatural.
It would either be a fundamental contradiction, like trying to explain a fourth dimension using a two-dimensional drawing, or it would just be nonsense.
Right. So Revelation has to leave the ultimate truth of the supersensible world a matter of faith, not a matter of knowledge.
It puts a hard, permanent limit on what religion can claim to know. It can only talk about our duty, not our curiosity.
Which leads right into criterion 5. No new moral principles. Revelation cannot give us moral rules that reason couldn't have figured out on its own. The moral law is one unified thing. Reason can't speak with two different voices, one to God and one to us.
So if a revelation says, for instance, that a specific ritual is inherently good, or that a specific day of the week is morally required, and you can't derive that from pure reason, it fails the test.
It fails. The function of revelation, when it comes to morality, is just to remind us of the law in our hearts, or to state those laws with divine authority to help us. but every single one of them has to be rationally derivable. Revelation clarifies it doesn't invent.
Okay, now for what might be the toughest challenge to traditional religious motivation. Criterion 6. Promises and rewards must be consequences, not motives.
This is huge. It demands that our obedience has to come from the purity of the will, from achtum, not from self-interest, not from glick. Any revelation that uses the threat of eternal damnation or the promise of heavenly reward as the reason to be good, that contradicts pure morality.
So if I'm only a good person because I'm terrified of hell, Fichte says my actions are not actually moral, even if they're the right actions.
Correct. Your actions have legality, but they don't have morality. You're acting from self-interest. You're putting the sensual drive fear, in this case, above the pure reason drive for duty.
So heaven and hell can exist, but only as philosophical guarantees of ultimate justice, not as a carrot and a stick to get us to behave.
That's it. They can be consequences that reason postulates, but they can't be bribes or threats used to compel choice.
And finally, criterion 7, means of virtue. Things like prayer, meditation, ascetic practices. They have to be presented only as means that are physically possible.
Right. They have to stand in some kind of natural causal relation to our nature. They can't be presented as unconditional commands, and they can't be put on the same level as the moral laws themselves.
So prayer can be empirically effective. Fichte would say it could, quiet the senses and help you focus on your duty.
He would. It has a natural psychological effect.
But you can't be commanded to pray because you can't command someone to feel the need for it.
Exactly. You can't command an emotional or spiritual state, so it can't be a universal command. If a revelation insists that morality depends on some specific commanded ritual, it violates the primacy of the moral law, which has to be accessible to everyone through free reason alone.
Fichte has just policed the entire boundary between pure reason and empirical religion with surgical precision. If a revelation fails even one of these 7 tests, it's out. It's illegitimate.
It's a completely self-contained, critical moral system that acts as the ultimate filter for any and all spiritual claims.
Okay, so this brings us to the final philosophical tightrope walk. We've established that a revelation is logically possible and that it's empirically needed for the morally weak. And we have the criteria to judge its content. But can we ever actually know that a specific revelation is divine? Can we get to certainty?
The short answer is no. We can never have theoretical certainty. Fichte returns to the limits of knowledge and says no theoretical proof, neither a priori nor a posteriori, is possible.
Let's talk about the a posteriori proof first, the one that usually relies on miracles or historical events.
Right. If you try to prove divinity by pointing to a miracle, some event that seems inexplicable by natural causes, you run straight into the problem of the infinite chain of causes.
We as finite beings can never know if an event is truly a first supernatural cause or if it's just the next link in a natural chain whose law we haven't discovered yet.
Exactly. We don't know the full extent of nature's laws. So calling something a miracle is really just a statement about our own current ignorance. It's not a positive statement about supernatural intervention.
To assume we know the first cause is, as Fichte says, vermessenen, presumptuous.
So using a miracle as proof of divinity requires a kind of knowledge we just don't have. It's impossible.
Which leaves us with this profound antinomy of revelation. The theoretical mind has to conclude, thesis, recognizing a revelation on theoretical grounds is impossible.
But then the practical moral mind responds with the antithesis, recognizing a revelation for the sake of determining our will. In other words, faith is possible.
We can't know it, but we can still accept it. So if we can't rely on theoretical proof, how does Fichte justify this practical leap of faith?
The acceptance is grounded entirely in Wunsch, a wish that's based on an empirical need, and this is what he calls formal, empirically conditioned faith. It's a belief driven by the practical utility of the system, not by proof.
That sounds dangerous. If I just believe something because I wish it were true and it helps me, isn't that just self-deception?
Fichte puts 2 very strict moral limits on this wish to stop it from being arbitrary. First, the wish has to be rooted in the moral law. It has to be a wish to fulfill your duty better.
Okay. And second, accepting the revelation has to demonstrably facilitate the execution of that duty. It has to be practically useful in strengthening your moral drive.
So if adopting a specific religious practice, let's say a disciplined prayer life from a certain tradition, genuinely helps me better resist temptation and stick to the duties I already recognize through my own reason,
then your acceptance of that revelation is philosophically legitimate.
Not because a revelation is theoretically true.
but because it is practically useful for your morality. The theoretical truth of the event itself. That's God's business. For us, only the moral utility matters.
So this leads to the final accounting of what Fichte's critique does. What do we lose and what do we gain from this severe system?
The losses are pretty clear. We lose all hope of getting new theoretical insights into the supersensible world. That door is shut for good by Criterion 4. And we lose the ability to coerce or persecute or subordinate other people based on revelation, because the moral tests rule out force and deceit.
And what are the gains? The biggest gain is complete security in our own internal faith. Since we have these a priori moral principles that govern what a revelation can even say, we know that any attempt to refute our faith by pointing to, say, an immoral command in a text must be false. Our faith becomes unassailable from the standpoint of reason.
And the ultimate liberation for the individual conscience.
Yes. We gain complete freedom of conscience from external moral pressure, from dogmatic claims, from what he calls spiritual vexations. No one can demand that you believe something based on fear or alleged historical facts or objective claims about the afterlife, because Fichte has shown that those claims are either theoretically impossible or morally damaging.
The individual is finally free from external religious coercion. That is a profoundly modern takeaway from an 18th century text.
It is. His critique doesn't destroy religion, it radically purifies it, forcing it to submit to the internal moral law.
And he ends with this very relevant point about religious education.
Right. He says the most effective and most moral way to instill this purified faith isn't through intellectual proofs or threats of hellfire. It's by first developing the person's moral feeling, making the good desirable in itself. Then you show them their own inherent weakness in the struggle against inclination.
And only then do you offer the prospect of revelation support as a practical tool.
You lead them to thirst for moral improvement, and then you offer the water of divine support to help them achieve it. That sequence is the only one that preserves moral freedom.
So what does this all mean for us? Fichte's relentless chase for a priori principles leaves the ultimate reality of any given revelation forever problematic. It's a matter of practical faith, not objective knowledge. For us, its truth and its utility rest entirely on one question. Does it make us better people? Does it reinforce the moral law that's already inside us?
Indeed. And the great paradox is that Fichte demands that if a revelation is truly divine, it has to actively protect and prioritize human moral freedom. Even if that means staying silent on the most fascinating mysteries of the universe, it has to guide our actions without compelling our belief.
The test of revelation is the moral action it inspires. What stands out to you as the most enduring, maybe surprising, standard that Fichte sets for divinity today?
For me, I think it's the combination of criteria 2 and 3, the absolute, unwavering rejection of all deceit and all coercion. I mean, in our modern information age, where the line between persuasion and manipulation is so constantly blurred, Fichte's insistence that a divine message cannot use any form of fraud or pressure, even in the pursuit of something as important as eternal salvation. That's a powerful and timeless ethical guardrail.
The means have to be as moral as the ends.
And the ends have to be moral to begin with.
An 18th century philosopher giving us the ultimate moral checklist for divine claims. Thank you for joining the deep dive into Fichte's moral compass.